Today is all about beautiful V necklines, this time on knit fabrics. This is one of them. I'm going to be showing you 4 ways of finishing V necklines on knit designs. It's very practical for you coming up. Hi sewing friends, I'm Karina from liftingpinsandneedles.com. Welcome to this channel that is all about sewing, limitless sewing, and in this special video continuing on the V neckline mini series I'm running on the channel. V necklines are beautiful. I love wearing them, I love sewing them, and I know that lots of people have issues with them, getting them to look nice, and I'm doing my best to bring together all the practical content for you so you can have these videos as a reference to come back to when you are sewing patterns with this type of design feature that is always very beautiful. I have already got part 1 up on the channel and it was all about woven designs. I went through 5 techniques there. Some of those 5 techniques involve facings, others involve bias tape, and you can use all of those in different ways. If you have not caught up with that one, go ahead and watch. I'm sure you're going to get a lot of things out of there for your own sewing. And we continue now with part 2, and this is about knit V necklines, which is very different. Usually you don't do the exact same thing you would with a woven pattern on a knit design. Now we're starting to incorporate a bit of neckbands and other things as well. In this video, I'll be showing you 4 of my favorite techniques to finish V necklines on knit designs. Knit designs are a little bit different. The way that these patterns are drafted involve negative ease. That means that usually the garment is smaller than your body measurements. And you will see that in this area where the neckline is, you will have negative ease. It needs to be there so that the neckline sits flush against your chest and your body so it doesn't gape. The techniques that you use involve materials that stretch vertically, horizontally to get that nice finish flat along your chest like this. There's no gaping, nothing like that. So it is totally different to woven styles and woven techniques. In all of these techniques, you will see some similarities, and some of these aspects will be touched on the techniques and others won't, but they are pretty much appropriate. You will see that you will have a V neckline on a garment, on a neckline, and you will be usually stay stitching that area and snipping into that. That allows this V section to extend and act almost like a straight seam so you can sew on the band or the other things that you're sewing on there. If you are working with lightweight, slinky fabrics like ITY, I would suggest stabilizing this V section with a small strip of knit interfacing. It usually helps bring a little bit of structure and make this V area easier to work with. You will see that on some of the footage and on some you won't. It just depends on the type of fabric and the feel. For other medium weight knits or even heavier ones like athletic knits, Ponte, Liverpool, I would think it's not that necessary to reinforce this area with interfacing, but definitely have a think about doing that for lighter weight fabrics. You will see some hand basting in all of these. I just can't get away from that. It is always a good tool for you that only takes you a few seconds of your time and makes sewing these areas that need precision much easier than dealing with pins that are falling out and you needing to fiddle and mess around with those, removing them while you're sewing. If you really despise hand basting, you can choose not to do that and use pins. That is always your decision. I've decided for a lengthy period of time that hand basting is my friend, and you will see it pretty much on any video I show you, and especially in this one. Also, you will see that the piece you are finishing the neckline with will always be a little bit smaller than the actual neckline. That will just bring it all in and help it not gape. You will see that the neckline and whatever method you're using is usually divided into quarters. Some other patterns might have specific notches for you to follow, so you don't have to divide anything. You will see notches on the neckline and on the band or binding or facing or whatever method. So just have a look at your pattern and decide what you want to do. I usually just like dividing things into quarters and going from there. It can be a really fast process to do instead of following notches on patterns. The result is the same. What the pattern has done when they have those specific notches for you is just make it a little bit easier for you if you don't want to be dividing things into quarters. We will start with the traditional V neckband that I know a lot of you like to wear and you like how it looks. You might struggle with getting this V really nice. There is a little seam in the center here of the V neckband that will match the V of the neckline. And here comes a full detailed step-by-step on how to deal with that. Let's see.
Don't you think this is starting to wear
This is the V neckline. I've got the bands just together there, right sides together, two extremes. There is a fold over there, and just to help myself, my fabric does slip a little bit around. I have drawn the seam allowance there in a blue friction pen, 3/8 of an inch there and there to help me sew. I have also hand basted that on just so it doesn't move around. First, I'm going to deal with the V. Once I've sewn this critical area onto the neckline, then I'll deal with the rest of the band. So I've sewn this V. I'll just take out these basting stitches, and now we need to clip into that there, just up to it as close as you can, but not through it. There, you can see that. And now we need to just open these little seams and then fold this onto each other to form the V. So that there, and then onto each other there, and there is a V. Now I'm going to meet this seam with the other seam here, and once I've got that all nice and tidy, I'm going to trim off all these little bits there. What I've done is hand baste these two seams together, and that would just keep them as one unit without them shifting around, and I don't have to worry. So that seam there is matching the seam under there because it's been hand sewn together. Just huge basting stitches, you know, this will be removed afterwards, but for now I'm confident that's not going to move anywhere. Now I'm going to remove these, and now I've got this unit here ready to be sewn onto the neckline. I'm going to fold these wrong sides together. Here are the references that I had when I divided my band into 4. So I'm just going to be placing a pin there for now because I'm folding the wrong side onto the wrong. I'm losing my reference points. So here's the V part. In essence, I've divided my neckband into 4. Here is the center back, and here I have 2 other pins to mark the other quarters. So 1 quarter, 2, 3, and 4 right there. So I'm going to put this aside and then mark quarters on my neckline, and then I can put these together. To mark the quarters on the neckline, this is the center back, and here's the center of the V. So I just match that, and then get the neckline there, and there I have marked the middle of that. So it's not where you have a shoulder seam or anything, it's just right there, sort of on the front neckline there, and the same on the other side. So for the neckline, I only need 2 pins basically, because the center back seam is a reference point. Then we have that one, then we have the V, that's the other reference point, and then that other one there, and that's how I'm going to match up quarters on this neckline. But first I'm going to stay stitch here. I'm actually going to draw the seam allowance here on the wrong side like I did on the neckband. I'm going to draw that and stay stitch that so that it's protected and it gives me a reference to unite these. This is the wrong side of the V neckline, and I have drawn there the 3/8 seam allowance, and I'm going to stay stitch there. I'm actually going to stay stitch about 1 millimeter inwards, so almost the seam allowance, like 1 millimeter short. Okay, so that's done, and now I have to clip into that one. Clipping into this V will allow this seam to extend right up to there, maybe 1 millimeter more. There. This is the neckband, and I have placed a pin through it, and actually you're not going to measure from the tip down 3/8 of an inch. If you did that, you would end up with a smaller seam allowance on the rest of the band. So from here to there would be about 3/8, then you'd end up with like 1/4 of an inch seam allowance here. So you need to consider it's 3/8 of an inch seam allowance for the band. That's coming there, and that's going to reach around this point there. So this is the point that needs to meet where I clipped on the neckline. So I have the neckline, that is where I have clipped. This is going to meet that place where I clipped. This pin goes right there, You can see where it's coming out right there. I'm just going to match these here on the side. There. And then this one here. The band is at the bottom and the neckline here is on the top. You can see all these pleats forming here in that center of that V. This is where sewing this bit is just going to take a little bit of precision. What I'm going to do now is hand baste that there so I'm not dealing with pins. I think pins can get in the way and just shift your things around. So if I can avoid them, I will happily. So I'm not going to sew a lot of this V, probably just an inch here and an inch there, not much more than that. And I'm just going to sew within the seam allowance here. And I'm going to catch this right there, almost on the seam line, but not really. If you can see what I'm doing. V-neck lines are beautiful, and I think just taking a tiny few extra steps is so worth it to get it looking really precise, you know. Okay, so you can see where I basted there and there. I have this pin going through that I can get rid of maybe, or I'll leave it. I might just leave it there. This pin just references the middle of the V with the middle of that seam on the other side on the band. So you can see that part where I clipped into there, it's sort of like extended here. So I'm just going to sew on top of that stitch right there, about an inch from the point there, that way. And in this part here on the left where I have a lot of excess, I'll just be careful. There, and now I can move this way, keeping all this excess there away from my needle. That's why I'm hand cranking. I really don't want to make a little pleat there if I can avoid it. Here is the V of the neckline that matches the seam of the neckband of the V. So I think this is pretty successful. So on this side, you're just going to see this little bit there. Under there is all that clipped business. I didn't get any puckers there or little pleats because I was really careful to sew slowly. And I hand wheeled those little areas there. So now I can just match up the quarters of the neckband to the quarters of the neckline and sew the rest as per usual. Okay, so I've got the right side of the neckline there, raw still, just the V line here at the bottom has been attached and the neckband on top. This is 1/4 matched with the neckline. You can see the neckband is slightly shorter than the neckline and it has to be that way to bring it in and not having a gape. So I'm gonna hand baste this. I'll just be stretching it out slightly so that they are the same size while I hand baste. So I'm just gonna take the time, hand baste this and then sew it at 3/8 of an inch and then serge it. Here you can see the neckband has been hand basted on. You can see the neckline a bit wavy there because it is slightly larger than the neckband, but it's supposed to be like that. I have tried this on and the length of the neckband is right. It's not short, it's not long, it's just right, you know. So now I'm just gonna sew. So I had sewn part of the V just partially and I'm just gonna start there where I stopped and just keep sewing and using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, slightly stretching this as I sew. Not shown here, but obviously after sewing this neckband on, I would serge all those raw edges so that it looks neat inside. I wanted to point out some extra things about neckbands that you might see in some patterns. The neckband that I've shown you had one shape, which was pointy on both sides. When you sew that together, you will see that you have some excess to cut off. That's fine, it's no extra work to do that, but you might find some patterns have a different shape on the end. It's like a little square. That means that there's been some attempt to true that, although when you do sew this and put your wrong sides together on that special seam in the center, you will still have some excess there that you need to cut out. So those are some differences you might see from one pattern to the next. one would not have trued that, so you'll have all that excess to cut off, and the other one would have attempted to true that, but you'd still have some excess to cut off. Also, I know in big four patterns, these neckbands have dots and reference points that help you sew the seam allowance that you might not find in other neckband patterns, where it just says sew with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance or whatever different seam allowance. If you see those dots, just follow along. And as I mentioned, some of the patterns just tell you to divide the neckband in 4. Others actually have specific dots and notches all over the band for you to match those specific dots or lines onto the neckline. So those are the different aspects of V neckbands that you might see in patterns, but at least in this section here, it's the same. You'll do it the same. That's the way I do it. That's the way I want to show you how I get the results that you want. You will find, of course, 1,000 other techniques out there. And that's the beauty of sewing. You can watch a few different techniques. You can try them for yourself and see what makes sense to you and what works better for you. This is one option that I am sharing with you, and I hope you like it. What you saw was based on sewing the Laundry Day Tee from Love Notions. This is a free pattern from Love Notions that you can get by joining the Facebook group. And in this one, you have different types of necklines, and one of them is the V neckline, and that's the one that I've got there. It's very nice, it's very neat. I think a V neckline sewn with the sewing machine will always give you a much better result, especially in this section here of the V, than if you just try to just serge everything and skip the sewing machine altogether. There is a time and a place for serges and knits. In my opinion, I would not skip the actual regular sewing machine to sew this neckband and this V. It's just so much more precise with the sewing machine. It's under there. You will see the snipped area here that will be covered with the neckband there. That section is always serged very neatly, so you don't have anything ugly inside. And you know, neat fabric doesn't really unravel. You're not going to end up with a hole there. Just make sure you've caught at least 1/8 of an inch in that corner right there on the point, and you'll be fine. Look, I've been wearing this Laundry Day Tee dress for over a year now, pretty much on a weekly basis. It's been washed so many times. I'm not kidding you. It's been washed more than 50 times, I'm sure. And my V-neck band is still going strong. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. It's not tearing apart or anything like that. So it can be pretty sturdy, and this is the basic technique. Now, with the second technique, instead of going into something more complex, we are going back into something more simple, and this is the crossover V neckband, which is easier to assemble, construct, and even to sew. It's a neckband that is just a rectangle. You don't need to be sewing into little shapes and cutting and snipping, nothing like that. And this is what we have here on the Orosi top and dress from Itch to Stitch. This is one of the options, where you have a band that just crosses over each other. Hard to see with this print, of course, but you'll see it much better in the tutorial. I'll show you how to do that. And because this is ITY, you'll see the stabilized V area with interfacing there, and you'll see how it improves everything. Let's go and see how this one can be done. You will find this technique on other patterns as well. You need to stabilize with a little strip of interfacing, just like 2 inches there and 2 inches there. This will help this area be more durable. This is also stay stitched there and then snipped into. This is the band piece for the V neckline. Just fold it in half lengthwise. Keep the raw edge on the top, the folded edge on the bottom. When you're doing this, it'll just make it easier. So just do that. The fabric wants to flip and curl because it's ITY. You've got your raw edges up here, your folded edge there, and then bring one end and then the other end that way. Make sure these edges are the folded ones and the raw ones are on the bottom. So just overlap one over the other. It doesn't matter which side you overlap. And this is how you form that V. This is easier, I find, than the traditional one where you have to sew like a little thing and snip and fold, and you know, this is just several steps less, and it still looks really nice. That's how it looks like on one side, and that's how it looks like on the other. Now it's helpful to do some basting stitches just there and there to keep this together, and then this can be applied onto the V neckline like any other V neckline, just the same thing. I'm doing this with a long stitch length, and now let's just baste all the way across the middle just so this doesn't move around like that anymore. This can be removed once the V neckband is on. Again, remember your raw edges are on the sides here and your folded edges are on the inside. So if you've got them the other way, it's still time. You can still undo this and flip it the other way. I have the front neckline extended here and I've divided it into 4 already so that that's ready to go. From this point to the center back there is a pin, that's 1/2, and then bringing these together will give you these other 2 halves that are always on the front neckline. Here is the V piece. Now I always like sewing from this side because I can really control how this is going to extend so I don't get a pucker. So this would go underneath. That's the way I do it, like that. We're using a 3/8 seam allowance. So 3/8 that way, 3/8 that way. In this case, you don't have that seam like you do when you sew those other types of V-neck bands. But where those 2 seam allowances intersect that way and that way is where this point is. And that's the one that needs to match this one right there. And then this one will go that way and that one will go that way. I like getting this little V section out of the way first, just sewing this little area and then sewing on the rest of the neckband. So this is how I'm going to sew with this on top, the band on the bottom. So there, right up to that little point there, pivot and then sew there. I like to sew this little section with a straight stitch. Then the rest of the band, I sew it with a shallow zigzag stitch, but nothing can beat the precision of a straight stitch in this section. Remove this basting stitch that we've done previously, and this is how the V neckline is going to look on this section. There's the V, there's the overlap right there. I had already divided my neckline into quarters and now I'll divide my neckband into quarters. So this will be the middle here. The V is a reference, the center back is there, and then we put these 2 together and then you get your other quarter over here. Look how fiddly this is. It's so fiddly. I mean, the fabric is just, but I never regret the fabric because it's so nice to wear. So that's 1/4 and this is going to be the other quarter. I'm just putting the pin randomly here because I'm going to neaten this up and curl it. Okay, so I uncurled my neckband. I've pinned the quarters, so the quarter of the band to the quarter of the neckline there and the center backs. The neckband is slightly shorter than the neckline, and now this is where you would now stretch the neckband to fit the neckline and sew all the way around. I want to do this with a serger. I think I'll have better access and control. I'll start from the tip and go stretching my neckband to match my neckline until I make it to the other side, and then I'll go to the sewing machine and finish sewing right there. This is one of the quarters there. I'll just remove the pins as I get there. And then I have the second quarter right there. Nice to leave a long tail of serger thread and use a big needle to put this through, and then you can tuck that back in there so it's nice and neat and you don't have any little bits of serger thread flying around. That gives it a really clean finish there on the V. So now I'm just going to go and sew with my sewing machine. I didn't trim away anything when I was sewing, and I can pick up where I stopped right there and sew all the rest now with a shallow zigzag because that was done with a straight stitch. So remember, from the point there I'd already sewn 1 inch. That's where I'm going to start now. Okay, so that beautiful V neckline is done. That's how it looks. You have a little overlap like that. I think it's a really neat way to do it. very similar to the other way, but it just avoids you that step of doing that stitch right there. So whichever way you overlap it, it's going to look different, doesn't really matter, and it's a cool V. You will find all these techniques on different patterns that you might want to try, that you might own or you might purchase in the future, and these videos can be a reference for you to see how they're actually done, you know, to accompany what you can see on pattern instructions. What happens though if you have a pattern that you love and it has a scoop neckline or a really high boat neckline or whatever, and you want to change that and just create your own V? Well, that is what part 3 of this series is going to be about, and I will be including how to draft your own neckband like this, and also how to calculate the length if you want to try and do your own crossover neckband, which is so much easier. All you have to do is take some measurements and draft a rectangle basically. So that will be coming in part 3. In this video, I'm basically focusing on the how-to, on how to sew this onto the garment, but it will get much more creative for you once you know how to make your own pieces and adapt your own necklines to any other patterns you have. And that is a future video coming up. Going on to technique number 3, this one involves knit binding that is inside the neckline. And to show you this, I have my beautiful Nyoka dress from Sinclair Patterns. I really loved sewing this. You have the V there. This is based on a design that has a center front seam. You will have a center front seam on the binding inside. The binding is folded in, and on the outside, it's such a beautiful finish. It's very beautiful, very neat. And you can also do this not only on this pattern, I'm sure. And let's see how that's done. Give you my soul, but you can't love some. This is how the binding piece looks for the V neckline. You can see it's got that little shape there. It was cut on the fold. You can cut your own binding piece as a long rectangle. On the short little ends, you need to trim those into a 45-degree angle. That's very easy to draw on both short ends so that you end up with a little pointy end on both of these short ends. This binding technique will work better if your knit is a medium weight and so is your binding piece. This method, I think it would be more difficult to work with if you're using a very lightweight knit for the binding itself. What I've done here is serge the center front first. I'm going to be pressing these seams open. Basically now I can pin the binding to the neckline. Put a pin to mark the center back right here. I've also got a pin on the center back of the binding and I'll match those. The seam allowance you use to sew this is 1/4 inch, which is great. I love using that seam allowance for binding. Here is the mark for the shoulder. I'll match that there. You can see that the binding is only a tad smaller than the neckline, not much at all. This rest of the binding will reach up to there. You can see this one is shorter. It has to be to bring that neckline in. And you can see that little shape right there, that needs to match this shape there. So you need to have that edge be right there. You can see how much longer the neckline is compared to the binding, and I'll pin it over here as well on the other end. So I'll just go ahead and sew this with 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm using a straight stitch and I will be stretching the binding slightly to match the neckline up to there. This is where I have my next pin there on the shoulder. It's not a large area, and I'm using my 1/4 inch presser foot to help me sew very, very accurately. Shoulder seam should be pressed towards the back. That's how that binding looks. I have snipped into the seam allowance on the back of the neckline, and before I do the rest, I'm going to understitch, but not from the very edge. I'm going to start about 1 inch in. I don't want the understitching to get in the way of how this is going to finish, so I'll start there, pushing the seam allowance towards the binding. Okay, so I've put the center fronts together, including that binding piece there on the top. Remember, I had serged the edges separately because I'll be pressing this open and it's easier to have that serged first. The binding technique does end up with open seams in the center, so that's why I've done that. So here we have that weird little shape, right? And we've sewn everything accurately with 1/4 inch. So we sew with 1/4 inch up to there, and where that seam starts, you need to pivot and then keep sewing here on the same 1/4 inch seam allowance. I've drawn it just to make it easier for you to see. and for myself, so I know exactly where to pivot. I've put a pin here to get these two seams to match exactly, this one and that one. I really don't want that to go anywhere. Here we're almost at the part of the binding where the pivot happens. I'm not using my 1/4 inch foot here, so I can have good visibility here where I need to pivot. Okay, so that's how that looks. Now if we just bring this in, you can see that if you open this seam there, it'll fall right on top of the seam of the center front, and then you have that V right there, super crisp. This is why I didn't want to understitch right to the edge. I didn't want that to get in the way. You can see there's seam allowance for you to fold this under like this, and then that will form a V right there in the center. I've gone ahead and pinned all the way around, and here on this tip, what's folded under there is like 1/8 of an inch or less. So I'm going to be hand basting that point there super accurately so it doesn't fall out of my pin. I really don't want a raw area there. Then all the rest is folded under by a good 3/8 of an inch. It's maybe that much. I don't want my binding to end up being that wide. I will definitely hand baste this whole thing before I sew it down. From the edge, I'm using the guide of 1/2 inch seam allowance, and that's what's getting me to sew right on the edge of the binding. So I'm just going slowly and carefully. The hand basting helps a great deal. Here I'm almost at the point where I'll be pivoting for that V section. I'll just be very careful to be very accurate there. I am sewing from the wrong side up so I can be accurate with the binding, so I am trusting that on the other side it's looking as neat as it is on this side. You might find some patterns out there that have a center front seam, and the way that they finish that is just by folding in the edges and then sewing the center front seam down, and that seems to finish there. I think that could be improved with using this binding technique with a knit. I would suggest this type of technique for medium weight knits. I wouldn't want to be doing this on a rayon spandex or an ITY. In those cases, I would always prefer a neckband. But if you have a really nice athletic knit, a Liverpool, a Ponte, I think the binding technique that is inside is going to look beautiful and it's going to finish everything super neatly. Now, the fourth technique is something that you might not be thinking about, but it is totally possible. Again, this one is not meant to work very well with a knit that is too lightweight. I wouldn't do this with an ITY or a rayon spandex, a modal, a bamboo, that sort of thing. I wouldn't go there. But if you have a Liverpool knit, if you have an athletic knit, if you have a heavier rayon spandex, cotton spandex that is a little heavier, lining that bodice could work really well. Yes, I'm talking about dresses. You can find dresses that have a V neckline and you can line them. And my example here is the Turner dress from Cashmerette. This is a design for knit fabrics. It's not for woven fabrics. And I've self-lined this one. The bodice is double, completely double. And because I had enough fabric, I used the same. That's why you can see that. And I'm going to show you how to finish this V neckline technique, which is very, very similar to what you would do with a woven when you're lining a woven bodice. It doesn't change that much, but because this is meant to be used with medium weight knits, it's going to work really well. Only a tad more fiddly, but it works really well. Let's see. What can I do? This is going to be a lined bodice. In this case, I am self-lining. I'm using the same fabric because I had enough, but you can use a different type of knit inside. You can use something that's a little bit lighter, although I would suggest it not being that light. This is a medium weight, pretty structured knit, so this technique works, and it's basically very, very similar or almost the same to what you would do with a woven design. You would cut two bodices that are exactly the same. You would sew the shoulder seams and then unite the necklines, one on top of each other, right sides together, marking a point there where you need to pivot that V, sewing all the way around with the seam allowance. In this case, it's a 3/8 seam allowance. At the point of the V, I go super slowly. I do hand crank a little bit because this area is so visible when you have a V that's off center, even by 1 or 2 stitches, you can tell. Just take your time and do this nice and carefully. Once this is sewn, you can snip that. I went a little bit crazy snipping a little bit too much. You don't need to do that much. And then because this is a structured knit, you can go ahead and understitch in the same way that you would with a woven pattern. It's just a little fiddlier, it takes a little bit longer. You push the seam allowance towards the lining layer that you're sewing, and you can even understitch through that V because you've done all those little snips. This is how it looks inside. It's always going to be a super nice finish. I have always been a fan of lining bodices. I think they just look better, they feel better on, they feel more supportive. And because usually these fitted bodices made out of knit fabrics can be very close fitting to the body, there's always the risk of seeing the outline of the texture of the bra lines underneath, in the front, in the back. So having a lined bodice is beautiful. It will cover all of that, but also makes making a V so much easier than doing binding or neckbands or anything you sew. It was just sew it, do everything the same, sew, snip, understitch, flip inside, and you have a beautiful V neckline there that can also work. If you're doing a design that has sleeves, then you would just baste the edges of these together and sew on your sleeves in a single layer, easy peasy. Then there's other methods if you're doing sleeveless, but that's not the focus of this video. The focus was doing that beautiful V neckline that is very crisp and looks amazing on. I hope you like this video. I hope it's useful for you. Keep your eyes open for video number 3 that will actually give you all the freedom you want to create your own V necklines on any patterns you want. I'm going to show you how to create a neckband and also the different neckband that just crosses over, which is much easier. I won't include the sewing of how to do that because this is in this video, but I will show you how to modify these necklines, how to measure them, how to know how long to make these rectangles. They are basically just rectangles. We're not drafting anything difficult here, and I hope you're excited for that one. I will see you again very soon with more sewing. Bye. Have a great weekend.